welcome Steve, James, and Alex Kotlowitz. Thanks for coming. Steve, you've been drinking since like 4 here today.
Well, this is the only interview opportunity I ever get where I get to drink and talk. So.
Pretty nice.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. The film, which isn't out quite yet in Chicago, is great. And it mainly concentrates on the folks at CeaseFire who go in and interrupt violence. But there's another part of CeaseFire that I'd love to start with, if you don't mind, and that is the philosophy behind the organization that violence especially in violence-plagued neighborhoods, is akin to an infectious disease. And I was wondering if that initially was something that attracted you to. There's many people who go after and try to stop violence, but that's a unique take. Is that something that interested you from the get-go about this project?
You know, I think it intrigued us. I mean, it offers this different way to look at what's going on out there. But I think really what brought us to this film ultimately were the Amina and the other 2 interrupters, Kobe Williams and Eddie Bocanegra, who you haven't met here, who were kind of like, you can see Amina, I mean, she's a force of nature. And they're kind of superheroes out there. And so we were real interested in them and their own personal journeys and their own lives. And their sort of job out there is to go out and suss out disputes and, you know, like in some ways like an infectious disease worker, to try to sort of interrupt the transmission of the violence, to try to interrupt it before it goes from one person to the next. But it was those individuals that I think really attracted us to doing this film.
What's interesting about the idea of individuals going in to stop violence on a very specific case-by-case basis, and also it corresponds to the philosophy of the organization in terms of it as a disease, is that in some ways it goes against the idea, the liberal idea, that what we need to do first is fix the schools, we need to fix endemic poverty, we need to have more job opportunities. And this is saying, okay, yeah, we should do those things. It's not against those things, but it's saying, if we stop the violence, those other things may indeed come. Do you agree with that point of view?
Well, you know, we have a little debate in the film. You see that in one of the scenes where that's debated to some degree. And we don't spend a lot of time on it, but one of the interrupters kind of takes the position that we do need to fix all those other things, that you can't just fix the violence. They're all interrelated. But I think what was interesting to us is, so we don't really take a position on that. We think it's a really interesting discussion to have. We clearly agree that we need to pay attention to all these other problems that we have. But I think one of the things that was really fascinating to us was, here are these individuals who you see in the movie really making a difference in a very direct and personal way. And so even as we try to figure out all those other things and try to make systemic change, and whether we can or not in the world we live in now is a good question, it doesn't stop Kobe, Amina, and Eddie and people like that from being able to go out there on a very individual level and make a difference and actually change people's lives. And that, to us, is the thing that's so inspiring about having worked on this film.
Well, let's talk about the individuals. Let's start with Amina. And all 3 of them have their own troubled past. And in their own way, CeaseFire, not only are they helping the community, but it's helping themselves. Let's take Amina. Her father was one of the most famous. He was just in the Sun-Times today, actually, mention of him.
Right. So she comes from kind of royalty in Chicago. She's the daughter of Jeff Fort, the sort of legendary gang leader, the kind of modern-day Al Capone, and
a certain kind of royalty.
A certain kind of royalty, right? So Amina grew up, you know, and she actually didn't have a very good relationship with her dad growing up. He wasn't around very much, and I think in some ways she kind of rebelled against that. And she became an enforcer for a local gang, a local drug dealer down the south side, who actually now is also an interrupter. And, you know, she led a fast life, to say the least. We've got these great photos that we covered of her.
Well, she says, drugs, party, guns, fun. You know, that was what it was about.
Right.
Out of all of them, and they all handled their job in a different way, but she is by far the most kind of vibrant, the most energetic, the most in your face about things.
Yeah, I mean, Amina is like you know, as Alex said earlier, a force of nature. She's like, it's like she's this street therapist who has many different ways she can approach a situation. She can get in your face, like you see in that clip that you saw. She can sit on a park bench with a young woman that's a very big part of the story, named Capricia, who's 18 years old, and just have the most intimate kind of conversation with her to try and, you know, cajole her into doing the right thing. I mean, she has this ability. She was just telling me about a situation she dealt with at the Walmart on Roosevelt 2 days ago, where a woman was getting into it with an employee over her daughter working there, and she just kind of stepped into the middle of this 6'1" woman who was ready to hit somebody, and she just dealt with it. And so she's fearless, but she also has this sort of ability to kind of adapt the approach to what the situation calls for.
Right, and she's incredibly disarming. So you kind of
Yeah.
I mean, she goes into that group of guys, and they're completely. I mean, they've lost whatever bravado they had in front of her.
I guess the question is, in that scene, for example, she talks to them, they lose that, they listen. What happens 10 minutes after she's gone? She's out of the picture.
Well, you know, the reality is that in that particular situation, that was a kid had been murdered sitting outside his home in a car, and those guys were on a, you know, wanted retribution for who they thought did it, was responsible. The reality is that there was no retribution made in that situation. Now, did she turn each of those guys around and they're now going to college and all? No, but they did not act on that, and that's a pretty amazing thing. And some of them, she handed out cards. You see in the film, you didn't see it in this clip. She hands out cards and stuff. You know, some months later, there was a kid related to that whole situation whose mother reached out to her. We filmed this, it just didn't end up in the movie. And she went out and had lunch with this kid and talked to him about what he's doing with his life, went back and talked to his grandparents who were raising him. You know, so things came out of that, which is very common. It's like they deal with the situation, and then out of that, someone hears about it, or it's somehow connected, and they reach out to the interrupter when they need them.
How bad, and I don't mean this in any lightly way, like how bad is violence in Chicago? Because you know, you would watch the evening news, and every night there is something horrible, and then the line is, well, they're painting a terrible picture. They're only covering the worst of it. But then you watch a movie like this, or you read certain statistics, and you're like, the violence really is that bad. So kind of put it in context. Are these places war zones, or is it just, no, there's a lot of violence, but there are also people living their lives, and for the most part, it is a peaceful life.
Right. Well, I'm real uncomfortable with the kind of analogy of war zones, because they're not war zones. I mean, they're, in fact, very different. I mean, one, the violence isn't as bad, and two, unlike a war where there's a sense that someday there might be a resolution, there isn't any sense in these communities at the moment. But things are bad. I mean, just some perspective. So, you know, 20 years ago, there were 950 murders a year in the city. They're now roughly half that. So we've actually made a fair amount of progress. But having said that, given that, it feels, and I will tell you, Steve, I think would attest to this from his time working on hoop teams, and from my time working on There Are No Children Here, it feels just as bad as it did then. And I suspect part of the reason is it's become even more concentrated in certain neighborhoods. And I think also, too, the violence has become somewhat more random. I mean, one of the things that was, I think, notable to us when we spent time on this is it's clear that at least the black gangs are no longer what they once were. They're not as hierarchical. And in fact, one of the things that you'll hear is that rather than refer to groups as gangs, cliques. They now refer to them as cliques, and it's just groups of 2, 3, 4 kids on a block, young men on a block who may even be from different gangs who are kind of running together.
Well, one man notes that the violence, everybody says, well, that's gang violence. A lot of times, it's not gang violence.
Right.
He says it's that there was a grievance, and it turned into violence,
Right.
but it wasn't one gang versus another.
Yeah, I think the media tends to want to equate it to gangs because that's something they can understand, you know, but it's definitely different. But, you know, the other thing, just to add to what Alex is saying, it's like, yeah, it's not a war zone, but on the other hand, and absolutely, and one of the things that was very important to us is that we wanted to show these as communities that are worth saving, and that the people that live there feel that way. But on the other hand, too, it's like, you know, as somebody says near the beginning of the movie on the media, it's like over the year of time when we were following it, as many people died in Chicago from urban violence as soldiers, American soldiers, died in Iraq and Afghanistan during that year. And that's just Chicago. That's just Chicago. And so we tend to wring our hands over the loss of life, American life abroad in these foreign wars. And I think for Alex and I, it was like, you know, there's a lot of loss of life going on right here in our backyards that we're kind of just accepting as like, well, that's just the way it is.
Now you mentioned your book. That was 20 years, about 20 years this
Right.
year.
He always has to get the mention of the book. Have you noticed?
It's for sale outside.
There you go.
Hoop Dreams you can rent at your local Blockbuster.
We're on Netflix too. Because Blockbusters.
I've got to say,
kinda
when we
gone.
were out filming, this was kind of a constant competition that Steve and I would have.
And who won?
Steve won. We would go out. I will fess up now. But when we were down shooting, one of the interrupters would always say, "So, hey guys, you guys see the movie Hoop Dreams?" And the guys would say, "Oh yeah, I'm familiar with that. I know Hoop Dreams." And they'd say, "You read this book," and they can never get the name of my book right.
Yeah.
But
Or your name.
See, I was going to ask you that. When you try to get access,
But here's the great
do you
thing.
have a card that says, I directed Hoop Dreams? And they're like, yeah, you can film me.
No, but it did help with Kobe. Kobe was very shrewd. I mean, because one of the questions that always comes up with this film when you see it, and maybe you get a sense of it from the scene you saw, is were you able to be there in those situations and not have it, you know, go south, or people say, get the camera out of here. And part of the key to that is, you know, there's a lot of answers to that, but one of the things that Kobe was particularly good at, one of the interrupters, was of making not a big deal of it. And what part of his strategy would be to say, he'd go into a situation because he knows white guys with a camera and all that immediately people think, wait, cops, sting operation, what is this? Dropping Hoop Dreams or There Are No Children Here was a way of sort of immediately putting people at ease over that.
The beginning of the film, or near the beginning of the film, you're filming a fight, a live physical fight happening. You watch that and you're lost in the film, but at the same time, there's a part of you that's saying, wait a minute, Steve James is right there with his camera. What is going on? How come they're not punching Steve out too?
Right. Well, I wasn't there at that moment, actually.
Yeah.
Because actually, we ended up having 2 cameras in that situation because there was a crew in from a PBS show that was shooting a magazine piece.
So you're taking other people's footage for this movie?
Yeah, we stole it.
All right, yeah.
But we were filming. What happened was...
I learned a secret.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We were filming that situation, but then we left with one of the guy that got his teeth knocked out because they were taking him to the hospital, and then that thing erupted right there. But we were in other situations, but it's like, I think that, you know, the key in all that is that in certain situations you need to maintain a certain distance, but in other situations it's more about just when people are that angry about something that's going on in their own lives, the camera really does become secondary, and it's for them it's almost like it doesn't matter anymore.
Right. I mean, there's a moment in the film actually, which in some ways is more tense than that, where Kobe has been called by somebody he had met in the county jail years ago, who is about to go off and murder 4 people who he feels has wronged him. He thinks that they turned him into the police, and he's there. He's got a gun on him. He's on the phone getting a car with, you know, over to his place without any license plates. And he says, "I'm not with CeaseFire," and language that not worth repeating here.
Oh, I think it'd be worth it.
But I mean, that's a situation where, you know, when Flamo, that's his name, is when Flamo came downstairs, Kobe had called him and told him we were going to be there. And when he came downstairs, you know, he kind of paused and said, "Man, are you guys cops?"
He said no. He said, "Who the fuck are you again?" You can beep that.
Please don't use that language,
Okay.
Steve. Here.
Right, because your owner doesn't use it, right? That's right. And so Kobe just said, "You know, man, this is," he would call us his film crew. He'd say, "This is my film crew, and we're just here." And Flamo then just kept on going. I mean, he was so...
Because he was so angry about other things.
Right, we were incidental.
But at that point, he really didn't care about us filming him because as far as he was concerned, he didn't care if he went back to prison. Yeah. So it didn't really matter that we were there. You know, it was like he wanted retribution for what had happened. And he was 32 years old, and as he told Kobe in the heat of that moment, "I've spent 15 years behind bars. What do I care?"
Yeah. The book was 20 years ago. Hoop Dreams was around that.
No, it's less than
Less
that,
than 20
actually.
years.
Yeah.
But
About
the question
17
is,
years ago. You know, we've been doing other stuff since then. Just want you to know. I mean, it's not like, you know.
you made that movie about that runner, right?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
I've seen them all. Death's Door, Stevie. Remember last time I recited every single movie you'd ever done.
Great.
Your home movies I was talking
and
about.
And you showed yourself playing pickup ball too, I think.
I did. I did.
It was a long
and you told me
moment
how
for
many points you averaged in high school.
That's right.
How many was it?
It was 11 and a half. But it was a slow-up team. We didn't run the ball much. So.
Anyhow, my question is a serious one, which is, okay, so 20 years ago you can make these films. Now or book.
Right.
Now you make this movie.
Right. Is it going to be 20 years
more? That's
exactly
it. No. What is to stop 20 years from now, you or someone else having to make a similar type of film, and what should the audience, people either from those communities or people from other communities, take out of these works so that the film isn't just entertainment?
Yes.
Right. Well, I think in some ways, There Are No Children in Hoop Dreams kind of documented their conditions in these communities. And I think what we hope to do with this film, despite the grim nature of the subject, that to give a sense that there's some promise, that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Needless to say, you couldn't ask for a kind of grimmer subject matter. But I got to tell you that Steve and I have talked about this. We've never had so much fun working on a project as this, and I think in large part it was because of Amina, Kobe, and Eddie. And there's something really inspiring about their work. And you look at what they've done, and you think that in fact there is something that we can do out there.
But the other thing too is that I've been working with Kartemquin Films, a great Chicago institution, for 25 years. Yeah, Kartemquin. And Kartemquin's philosophy has always been with their films is that we're not just making thought-provoking entertainment. That we really do want these films to have some use beyond that. And so we're very serious, as Kartemquin's been over the years, about trying to do outreach and civic engagement with the film so that it's not just seen. It's going to be released theatrically starting here later this summer and in other cities, and that's great, but there's certain kind of audience that will see the film in that context, and then there's other audiences for this film that we hope to reach, and so we're very active on that front as well.
Real briefly last, talk about the responsibility that comes with not only getting that access, but talking to people at their most vulnerable, and oftentimes people who in most situations are actually, they're not people going on Oprah bleeding their soul. They are people who are reluctant to show their vulnerable side.
Right.
Talk about the responsibility that comes with that.
Right.
Well, I was just going to say, I've always been attracted to subjects who don't see themselves as being subjects in a film or on a TV show or a reality show, for God's sakes. And it's like, because those are the people that I'm interested in. And so, it's a courageous act for anybody to be in a documentary, to be honest about their lives in a documentary. It's an incredibly courageous act. But I
Even
really,
George Will in those baseball documentaries?
well, maybe not him.
Okay.
But it's I really do think that people do it, at least in my experience in the films I've done, they do it for all the right reasons. They don't do it because they think they're going to get famous. They don't do it for sure because they think they're going to get money out of it. They do it because you've managed to convey to them that why you're doing this has some higher purpose, and they see that, they get that, and so they participate in that.
Right, and I think the other part of it too is you're dealing with people who, as you suggested, are private individuals. They've got no responsibility or obligation to talk to us, and so it's a real privilege to be let into their lives, and you've got to sort of treat it as such. And I think it's one of the things that Steve and I really share, and it made it easy to work together for this reason, is this a sense of honor and frankness and candor with people about what you're doing. And in fact, one of the things that we did with this film is when we had a rough cut ready, we showed it to the main subjects of the film to make sure there wasn't anything obviously that was factually incorrect, but more importantly that there wasn't anything there that might compromise them, that made them feel uncomfortable, and that was, I think, really important.
Well, yeah, but I've done films, and in your books, I'm sure the same thing has happened, where the final film is uncomfortable in some ways, and you have to be willing to also face that with a subject too. And I think that, and I've had situations where I show films in advance, and it doesn't always, it's not a completely pleasant experience. But if you've had an honest and sort of really honest, candid relationship, you'll get through that. And you may not change the film to make them happy about it, but they'll understand, and they won't feel like they've been duped or misled, and they'll understand the choices you've made, and that's really all you can hope for in those situations.
Well, last question for real. When you go into communities that aren't your own, which you do pretty much on every single film, whether it's Stevie or at Death's Door or this film, do you come away, not to sound cliche about it, but feeling that there's a commonality to everybody's experiences, or is it the opposite, that people are really different and different communities are really different, or is there that common sense of humanity?
Well, I mean, I definitely think there's a common sense of humanity, and I think one of the good things I hope come out of the films I've done, and I know Alex feels this way about the books he's done, is you want people to make this connection across lines of race or class to somebody else's experience. I mean, I had people in Hoop Dreams say to me, I had no idea that inner city parents or mothers wanted the same things for their children that I want for mine. Now, on the one hand, you think, God, what a ridiculous thing that you would think that they wouldn't want that. But on the other hand, we are so divided. You know, we live in such a divided nation in so many ways, cut so many ways, that it's a totally reasonable insight for someone to have like that. And so I think that that's important. But the other piece of it that is that even though we may share many universalities and hopes and desires, I think one of the things that films can do and books can do is to make people understand the extraordinary obstacles some people face in trying to realize those. So that when you read about the ghetto mom who got her kids to college, and you think, you want people to understand that took an extraordinary act of something that as a middle class person you just take for granted.
Right, and I think one of the reasons you tell stories is to build connections. I mean, why else, tell other people's tales?
Well, thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for
Thanks
having
for
us.
having us. Yeah.
Alex Kotlowitz and Steve James.